Did you know there's just two kinds of people in the world? Metabolically speaking. That's true. I'm going to prove it to you. I have a project set up. I'm going to do a sequence of videos on insulin resistance. This one is explaining to you what is insulin resistance, so you believe that it's important. You know how to get it checked for yourself. But let's get started. There are only two kinds of people in the world, metabolically speaking. So the questions you have to ask yourself, what kind are you? Do you know? There's only two kinds of people in the world, metabolically speaking. So let me explain. First, I want to motivate you to get some basic, inexpensive labs done on yourself. Second, why these labs are extraordinarily important for you. Assessment is always the first step to better health. That's the world I live in, that's what I believe, and that's what I want you to believe. You don't have to get a lot of labs. You'll find out this is incredibly cheap. If you go to Starbucks, don't go to Starbucks today. Get these labs done instead. So background, have you ever felt that there are some things that happen to you that are a personal lesson? A voice calling into your life. Listen up there, buddy. This is for you. Well, that's what I got. Pay attention to what's in front of you at this moment, an all hands on deck experience. Wake up and smell the roses so you know what's going on. It was loud and clear to me, a moment that forever changed how I understood health, metabolism, and aging after 20 years of practicing medicine. What could change? I had seen it all, right? Well, a lot. The triggering event, and this is not a good story, by the way, came when I decided to try to figure out how to reverse diabetes in our 3-year-old cat, a rescue, Loki. We had 3 cats. They're 2 brothers. We had them for about 3 years and an older one. Anyways, Loki was just diagnosed with diabetes after catastrophic weight loss. We had just come back 5 days from being away, and we had somebody come in and check on the cats, and so all that was good, but they're skittish cats, and so they only saw the female. Didn't see the brothers. So when we came home, we saw a cat that could barely walk, had soiled himself, was walking across the floor, and was 5 pounds lighter, dropped from 15 pounds to 9 pounds. So this was our first exposure to feline diabetic ketoacidosis, DKA, which is usually the end stage of diabetes in cats. They die afterwards. I thought, what the heck, this doesn't make sense. Not metabolic sense, as I understood it. He wasn't obese, but lean. He wasn't old, but just turned 3. We were very careful about his diet. His brother, the same age and weight, up until 2 months prior, was normal. And his 5-year-old sister was fine as well. All were rescue cats. There's no obvious cause, his blood glucose problem, no pancreatitis, and never developed any pancreatitis. Yet these cats represented 2 different metabolic groups, which made me wonder, is this true in humans as well? Lab work for cats is very limited. You can't just go get insulin. You can't get insulin at all, really. It's expensive and it's not immediate. I don't know why that is. In humans, one exception, it is easy to get. So we had to create a diet based on what we knew from humans and used our glucometer, human glucometer, and our human ketometer daily on Loki. We logged away all the data. Cats are obligate carnivores. They require a protein. It's much more specific than humans. They have 11 required amino acid on a daily basis. Humans have 8, conditionally 9, depends how you want to slice the dice, so to say. So we lost the battle after 9 months. It's not a good story. This was an extraordinary cat. It was amazing in both his mental mind, his physical prowess. But anyways, after 9 months, after 4 DKAs, we finally had to put him to sleep because he wouldn't come out of the last one. He was the smartest cat I ever knew. The idea of 2 metabolic groups, insulin resistance versus non-insulin resistance, wouldn't leave my thoughts. I had to confirm it. I decided to run scatter plots on all my clients' labs and separate them on their insulin resistance using HOMA-IR number of 1.4 as the cutoff number. You're going to learn about HOMA-IR in just a second. So the 2 groups were non-insulin resistant people and their labs. So take vitamin D. We have a group, it's non-insulin resistant, their labs of vitamin D, for instance. And then the insulin resistant group, their levels of vitamin D. And so we would do a scatter plot between those 2. Interesting, the results. And not going to do that now, but we'll do a number of other examples in the future, and you'll see that, wow, this makes a difference. In reality, there are really only 2 groups of people, non-insulin resistant people and insulin resistant people, metabolically speaking. Here's where it starts to get really interesting. For every lab result, there will always be two different groups regardless of labs. I'll explore some of these specifically in coming videos, but for now I just want you to know the concept of insulin resistance, how we got there, why we're comfortable in using that word, and what does that mean diagnostically in terms of labs, of course. Let's start with a little history. This is short. I'm not the first to think this way, that there are two groups of people. So there was a man who died not long ago, about 2017, so that's, 7 years ago. Dr. Joseph Kraft. He's now become known as the father of the insulin assay or the insulin test. But it's bigger than that, and I'm going to show you his trials and errors. We're going to come back to this picture later, but he was all about discovering insulin is the thing that makes the difference. So Kraft's research indicated that 75% of people with normal or borderline glucose tolerance tests, GTT tests, had borderline or abnormal insulin patterns. And he's the one who developed these insulin patterns. And that's what these are. These are all insulin patterns. Normal, gradually more. We'll get into it. And so he named them, but he had to convince the world that these were actually true. And he did a lot of work to convince the world. So likely these people with these other patterns had diabetes in site 2 or occult diabetes, another way of saying the same thing. So Dr. Kraft's major discovery was that the glucose tolerance test, GTT, can be totally normal. Hey, and that's how it was for 50 or 60 years. And still, actually, most doctors just do a glucose tolerance test and have nothing to do with insulin. It comes back and says, hey, you're fine, guy, lady, whatever. I don't see a problem. Well, they missed the boat. And that's where he comes in. So before Dr. Kraft, this is all that was done. This is a glucose tolerance test with glucose only. What'd they do? They gave you 75 grams of glucose. Boom. First of all, they took your fasting glucose. So you showed up in the morning, here's your fasting glucose number. They gave you the 75 grams, little drink, plug, and you're going to hate it. And a lot of people get nauseous. Then they're going to measure your glucose at 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes, and 120. And you're out in the course of 2 hours. He changed a number of those. He did the glucose tolerance test as you're seeing here, but he stretched that out for 2, 3, and sometimes 4 hours, and he did insulin at the same time. Let's look. If we simply measure fasting blood glucose, we will miss that the pancreas may be overworking. 2 speedometers, right? Glucose looks normal glucose numbers, 75, 95, you're fine, lady, you're fine, guy, don't worry about it, buddy. All right, but we don't do the insulin, we're never going to know how hard your pancreas is working to keep that glucose in the normal range. And it could be overworking and it could be burning itself out. All right, so what Kraft did is that he actually brought in glucose. Insulin. The glucose had always been measured, right? It's the brown line. Look, that's always been done. So that's the before. So what he started doing is 1 person at a time, he started adding in the glucose and goes, oh, that's an interesting pattern. So that's a normal pattern. That's what most people have that are not insulin resistant. Then you notice the insulin gets a little higher. The pattern doesn't, glucose not so much. The insulin gets really high and the glucose gets a little higher. I'm not going to memorize these patterns, but he now defined there are degrees of diabetes, both pre-diabetes and diabetes in itself in different categories. That was never done before, even though insulin had been used for at least the previous 50 years. Insulin came out, remember, in Toronto in 2023, in Dr. Beouf. Okay, so Dr. Kraft changed medicine forever, but not in a day. Here's another way of looking at these patterns, a little prettier. So there's normal, right? Normal insulin underneath, normal glucose. And so you see that the glucose gradually climbs, but look at the insulin. The peak gets delayed later, still climbs after an hour, still climbs after 2 hours, still climbing after 3 hours, still climbing and then drops off. So here you have type 1 diabetes. They don't have any insulin, so that's why that looks that way. And here you have normal. But for 80% of the people that Dr. Kraft tested had hyperinsulinemia, overproduction of insulin to control their glucose. Another way of looking at that, of the 5 groups, normal, type 1 diabetes, 2, 3, and 4 had hyperinsulinemia. Here's the pie chart. 5 is type 1 diabetes, right? And number 1 is normal. All of this, 2, 3, and 4, 80% have overproduction of insulin. What he had to put up with before they believed him, though, is the big deal. So in 74 or 75, he wrote some papers and he started collecting his own data. Now remember, he is not an endocrinologist. He's a clinical pathologist. He's the guy that you see on the TV shows. Hey, can you get that? Send the tissue down the path. Send the tissue down the path. Get this sample at the path. He's the guy that looks at that. So his first papers were in 74 to 75. By mid-70s to the mid-90s, he was collecting one at a time, doing insulin and glucose on the glucose tolerance tests. And he was developing this chart. This chart was made by Ivor Cummings. It's a pretty chart, but he used the data, and I'm glad he did. He used the data from Dr. Kraft's to put this together. So Dr. Kraft, by 1998, tested 14,384 people. That's the kind of dedication he had to prove his point, that it's not just black and white. It's not just, oh, they're diabetic and everybody else is healthy. Not at all. So over the course of 26 years, he performed these at St. Joseph Hospital, where he worked in Chicago. It's interesting, at St. Joseph, and he's Joseph, we see he's a saint of St. Joseph. Important to know, he was a clinical pathologist in the nuclear medicine department of St. Joseph's. So from the age of 42 to 68, which is from 1972 to 1998, he plugged away, accumulating his data one person at a time, because he believed it was important, which it obviously was. And at the age of 86, he finished putting all his data together and wrote a book saying, Diabetes Epidemic in You. Probably if I said, should everybody get tested? Absolutely not. Only those who are concerned about their future. Is exactly how I feel. Everybody should get tested. And he's talking about the glucose tolerance test. That's fine to do that, but I think you really need fasting glucose and fasting insulin to find your insulin resistance more. Here's a timeline I wanted to put together. So there's Dr. Kraft. He died a little while ago. This is when he did his work, started thinking about, it's not just black and white. 74 to 75, glucose tolerance test plus insulin. That was his thing. Then he's from 74 to 75 to 1998. He gets all those 14,382 cases. Well, in 1985, in Oxford, England, at the University of Oxford University in England, a guy named David Matthews develops a brief formula using fasting glucose and fasting insulin, puts that together to determine insulin resistance. It's called HOMA-IR. IR is the insulin resistance. I've covered that in a lot of other videos, but it's 1985. 1998, roughly 15 years later, Kraft finishes his work. 2001, another man at Stanford starts using the HOMA-IR. 16 years later, he uses this, and I'm going to tell you about that in a second. But he's famous for knowing a lot about diabetes. These are both, all three of these guys are icons, but these two primarily, certainly in the United States. Predictor of age-related diseases. So what he did, he simply used the HOMA-IR number, greater than 1.4 or less than 1.4. He used it by degrees, low, medium, or high. We'll talk about that in a second. So he died in 1918. And so in 2010, HOMA-IR, the insulin resistance use of HOMA-IR, started to be used pretty commonly as an insulin resistance diagnosis. But both of these tests, the glucose tolerance test and the HOMA-IR, use insulin and glucose for their determination of one's metabolic health. That's a big deal. Okay, so HOMA-IR, what is it? Well, if you live in the United States, we're the only non-metric country in the world, this is the formula you would use. And these are the units you would use. Pretty straightforward. I'll show you where you can go that online in a second. And if you're in the rest of the world, this is the formula you use. So there are two different formulas, but basically the same thing. Fasting insulin, different units. Fasting glucose, different units for the metric group. The rest of the world, and the US, it's different units, but basically it's the same thing. So back to that study that I referred to about Dr. Raven. So Dr. Raven used low, medium, and high insulin resistance. So they were all over 1.4, right? A little bit over, a little more over, a lot over. And what he did, he took 208 healthy, non-obese people that had a BMI under 30. You can say, wait a minute, 25 is supposed to be normal. So yeah, they were slightly heavy, but they're non-obese. So obese starts at over 30. So they were non-obese, but not real lean either, who were then evaluated between 4 and 11 years, an average of a little over 6 years, for the appearance of the following age-related diseases: hypertension, high blood pressure, coronary heart disease, stroke, cancer, type 2 diabetes. He followed them for 6 years and wanted to see what would happen. And the insulin resistance blew them away more than any other metric of any other disease. So here, how does that look like? The low, the medium, the high. 6 years later, we'll say, he comes back and says, how have things been? Any diseases? Anybody die? You still here? Yep. So all of the low insulin people were still there. And by the way, I think the average age was 40, by the way, I left that part out. But here's the link to that study. Should you want to read all the details, then you can go to PubMed and it'll pop up, it's there. So nope, nobody died, no disease to report. The medium insulin resistance people had 10 diseases and 2 people died. So it's a total of 12 events, if you will. The high insulin resistant people had 24 diseases and 4 people died. Huge. So it's a big difference. I say that, I underline it because he's the first saying, this is a useful number in being able to predict one's future. That's the message I want you to take away. Okay, so where are we going with this? We're going to simplify this into insulin resistance and non-insulin resistance. Remember those two groups? And for every lab, it can be divided into two groups. So we're going to look at those, whatever those labs are, vitamin D, uric acid, electrolytes, we're going to look at it into those two groups, and it's going to be a phenomenal story. What that looks like via a continual glucose monitor. So this is a Freestyle Libre that I work with, people put it on, and I get to remotely look at their recordings, and this is what an insulin-resistant person looks like. They can't control their blood glucose. So throughout the day, they have continuously high, might go down at night, and sometimes people go up at night more. Okay, and non-insulin resistance, they have a HOMA-IR under 1.4, basically flat and boring. It's kind of like being on the ocean in a calm day. It rises a little bit, but just a little bit, pretty much flat and boring. So how to find out if you are insulin resistant? You need two labs, fasting glucose, fasting insulin. The price of labs are LabCorp is under 20, Quest is under 30. If you can ask your doctor for it, your doctor should be willing to help you on this. If not, you can go to that and you can pay for yourself. They're very cheap. We don't get a penny out of this, and you can find out where in your neighborhood you can get this done. Okay? Till next time. So if this is something that you're interested in, that is a topic that I obviously go deeper in terms of labs, in terms of how to do it, in terms of why you would want to do it, various topics, as you've seen that I've done in the past, then please let me know below in a comment. Till then.